During the late 1800s and early 1900s, many Japanese immigrated to Canada for better living conditions and job opportunities. But instead of the wonderful thoughts, it ended up having an opposite effect from what the Japanese people wanted. They faced not just racism, but also the violation of their human rights in Canada.
The first ever known immigrant from Japan was named Manzo Nagano. He had arrived in British Columbia in 1877. Later on, the first group of Japanese immigrants, called IC, arrived between 1877 and 1928. But until 1907, almost all immigrants were young men.
Before Japanese people immigrated to Canada, the racism towards Asian Canadians such as Chinese immigrants was already high. Shortly after Japanese immigrants arrived in Canada, locals already began to develop hatreds towards them by spray painting signs on buildings.
In the beginning, the settlement of Japanese immigrants were developing the way they wanted it to. They were attending schools and played multiple sports with successful businesses, but that didn't last too long. Soon the violation of their rights started to happen and it became more severe as time passed.
In 1895, all Japanese Canadians were denied their rights to vote, and the laws excluded Canadians from working at underground mining, the civil service, and professions such as practice of law. But they were allowed to fish and sell goods such as food and clothes. That also changed later.
Labor and minimum wage laws ensured that employers hired Asian Canadians only for menial jobs or farm labor. On top of that, Asian Canadians had lower pay rates than Caucasian workers working the same job. But the Asian Canadians did not have a choice, as in this time period, racism was a big factor in the society.
Slowly, Japanese Canadians were seen as untrustworthy, menacing, and incapable of ever successfully creating business in the mainstream society. This led the local populations of Caucasian people to do the horrifying Vancouver riot.
On September 7, 1907, hostility towards Asian immigrants erupted. A mob of 9,000 people smashed windows and destroyed homes and shops in Chinatown and Japantown. This was known as the Vancouver Riot. This was also to discourage Asians from settling and remaining in BC.
When the mob of 9,000 people had reached the Japantown in Vancouver, they were driven away by few Japanese immigrants who were veterans of the recent Russo-Japanese War. This riot caused panic between many Japanese people and caused them to move away to other parts of BC or even to other provinces.
During World War I, when Canada had to assist the British in fighting the war, with a few rare exceptions, recruitment officers in BC would not accept any Asians for military service. They feared that they would be spies and leak vital information to the Japanese government. This rule was in place to keep the Japanese out of BC and intended to make them go back to Japan.
To avoid this practice, over 200 Japanese men traveled from BC to Alberta to enlist into the military. Of the 222 who served, 54 were killed and 13 received Medal of Bravery, including Sergeant Masumi Mitsu, who was recognized in his service at the Battle of Vimy Ridge.
Later on in World War II, the racism towards Japanese Canadians became severe because the attacks by the Japanese government on Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Pearl Harbor. This led to the US nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this was the first time ever humans used a nuke on another country.
Life for Japanese Canadians living in Canada became extremely difficult. The Canadian government forced them all to abandon their shops or homes to move away from the coastline of BC. They were given two choices. They either move inland or back to Japan. Some refused to do either of these, and they faced severe consequences.
Special trains carried the Japanese detainees to Slovak, New Denver, Caslo, Greenwood, and Sandon, all the ghost towns in the BC interior. Some others were offered the option of working on sugar beet farms in Alberta and Manitoba. Although getting paid way below minimum wage, this was a method of surviving and getting by in these hard times.
The Canadian government also feared that fish boats owned by Japanese living in Canada would be used by the Japanese to mount a horrific coastal attack on British Columbia. More than 1,200 Japanese Canadians owning fishing vessels were impounded as a defense measure.
The Canadian government created internment camps for Japanese people since their shops and houses were taken away. The condition in internment camps for Japanese people is very poor. They slept in crowded areas with small bunks, and they didn't have electricity or running water.
Those who resisted their internment were sent to prisoner of war camps in Pentawa, Ontario, or to Camp 101 on the northern shore of Lake Superior. It was built mainly for German and Italian combatants during World War I and World War II. Since many of them were young men, they often tried to escape. Although many escaped, only one wasn't recaptured.
Following public protests, the order in council that authorized the forced deportation was challenged on the basis that deporting all Japanese Canadians was a crime against humanity, and that a citizen could not be deported from his or her country that they live in.
In 1947, due to various protests among the politicians and academics, the federal cabinet revoked the legislation to repatriate the remaining Japanese Canadians to Japan. It was only in April 1949 that all restrictions were lifted from Japanese Canadians.
After 44 years, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney apologized to Japanese Canadian survivors and their families about internment camps and confiscation of their properties. He called the apology and the $300 million the compensation package, a settlement that heals.